Ah, the Olympics, that great biennial sporting event featuring regal ceremonies, stunning athletic performances, and medal tables. Lots and lots of medal tables. Your typical Olympic medal table will rank nations by number of medals won. But this isn't a great ranking system. Nations have very different population sizes, and obviously nations with more people will usually win more medals. Occasionally, you see a table that tries to fix this problem by ranking nations according to medals per capita. But while this does an excellent job at highlighting small nations that would otherwise go overlooked, it really just moves the advantage from the large nations to the small ones. If China, for instance, had wanted to match Liechtenstein in medals per capita in 2018, they would have had to win over 36,000 medals. Good luck with that. 3 years ago, I set out to fix this great injustice of medal measurement malpractice by creating the impressiveness-o-meter, which functions under the theory that the more mathematically unlikely a nation's success, the more impressive it is. If you want to learn more about the philosophy behind the formula and how it's calculated, you can go back and watch the video I made during the last Olympics. But here are the basics. It's based on a probability formula called a cumulative binomial distribution. It uses only population and medal data, it doesn't take into account anything else, and it produces a leaderboard that includes nations of many different sizes. In that first video, I ran the impressiveness-o-meter for every Olympics dating back to 1998. At the time, that was more than enough work. But I couldn't help but wonder, what if you went further? What if you used this formula to measure every Olympic Games in modern history, all 51 of them? And if you had to give an answer, which nation would you crown as the greatest Olympic team of all time? Well, it took literally millions of spreadsheet cells, but the impressiveness-o-meter has some answers. Going all the way back to the first modern Olympics presented some problems I hadn't encountered when I was just dealing with the more modern games. Even just figuring out the medal counts of early Olympics is complicated. Some medal tallies are disputed, some have been retroactively recalculated to match the modern gold, silver, bronze format, and in some sports, a few teams were made up of representatives from multiple nations. Historical population data is even worse. Most population data sets are incomplete, national borders have shifted a number of times over the past 125 years. On top of that, some Olympic teams are made up of multiple nations, while others are territories that represent themselves despite belonging to another country. The point is, shoving more than a century of complex geopolitical history into a tidy spreadsheet is a losing battle. But I did my best. So, without further ado, here are the impressiveness-o-meter results for every official Olympic Games in modern history. We start with the Winter Olympics, which began in 1924 in Chamonix, France. Early on, you can see that there's one pretty dominant nation. Norway is so dominant, in fact, that the big question is really who gets second. Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland are consistently high in the rankings, though the United States and Canada capitalize on home continent advantage to make a brief appearance in the top three in the 1932 Lake Placid Games. The 1936 Winter Games took place in Nazi Germany. Here, the Nazis get beat on their home turf by both Norway and Austria, which is very amusing. After that, the Winter Olympics get interrupted for 12 years by World War II. Things pick up again with the 1948 St. Moritz Games, where Norway is still in the lead, but they're finally starting to look beatable. In the 1952 Oslo Games, they take advantage of home snow to again dominate, and then, finally, in 1956, Norway slips out of first place, replaced by Austria. The Soviet Union makes its first Winter Games appearance here, leading in total medals and ranking 6th in impressiveness. Norway quickly restores order in 1960, and for a while, we're back to a list of usual suspects at the top. In 1968, the Netherlands makes their first appearance in the top 5, and in 72, East Germany begins a very quick rise through the standings, pulling ahead of Norway in 76 and keeping their lead in 1980. Liechtenstein, of all nations, comes in second, winning 4 medals from a population of 25,000 people. All 4 of Liechtenstein's medals were won by 2 siblings. And if we could just pause here to let me brag for a second, I think this is a great example of how the impressiveness-o-meter is a very inclusive ranking system. At this time, the Soviet Union has over 10,000 times more people than Liechtenstein, and yet they're both in the top 10. Throughout the rest of the 80s, East Germany continues to lead, and then in 92, Norway takes the lead again, while Italy hops into the top 5. From here, things begin to stabilize. Germany and Canada start climbing up the rankings. In 2006, Norway is unseated again by Austria, but not for long. Moving into the 2010s, things really begin to solidify, with Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, and Austria forming a fairly consistent trailing group behind the once again dominant Norway. So, that's the Winter Olympics up to the modern day. Now, as I mentioned before, the impressiveness-o-meter only uses medal and population data. This means that there's approximately an infinite number of factors that it doesn't take into account. But I think one of the most important ones is national wealth. There's not a perfect metric for this, but I think a decent stand-in is GDP per capita. So here's a graph which compares GDP per capita with impressiveness. Up and to the left here is good. Finland stands out in the early going on this graph, as does Austria a little later on. Honestly, I think the most interesting thing this graph shows is that the Winter Olympics is mostly dominated by wealthy nations. There aren't many competitive nations that are below half of the US's GDP per capita, which is the horizontal unit of measurement here. As we tick through the years, nations like Russia, Croatia, South Korea, and Belarus stand out a little more, while Norway's runaway success is tempered by the fact that they're quite well off. Now let's look at the rankings from the Summer Games. The first official modern Summer Games takes place in 1896, appropriately hosted in Athens, Greece. Greece leads, followed by the US and Denmark. You'll notice that early Summer Games have a very strong home field advantage, as France, then the US, then Great Britain, then Sweden dominate the games on their home turf. In these early years, the host nations send a huge number of athletes to the competition, a sign that the Olympics at this point hasn't yet matured into a truly worldwide event. The Games are canceled in 1916 due to World War I, and then in 1920, Sweden becomes the first non-host nation to take first place, beating out Finland and Norway. Finland then takes over the lead throughout the 1920s, and the US rides home field advantage to the front of the pack in 1932. Now, you'll notice that in 1936, a rather disturbing flag has suddenly appeared at the top of the rankings. This is the moment I wished I could tweak my formula, but I take comfort in two things here. First, this Olympics took place in Berlin. We're still in the era where host nations seem to get a large home field advantage, and relative to some previous host nation performances, Germany's performance here isn't that incredible. And second, one of the many factors that the impressiveness-o-meter doesn't take into account is the political will of a nation's government. In 1936, the Nazis believed that a good performance in the Olympics will demonstrate their racial superiority on the world stage. The 1936 Games are probably the most striking example of how the Olympics can be used to score political points. But it isn't the only example. Not by a long shot. The Nazis don't get a chance to repeat their performance, and it's completely their own fault, as World War II interrupts the Games for 12 years. Picking back up in 1948, Sweden is back in the lead, and Hungary registers a top 5 placing, then leaps all the way to first in 1952. Australia claims the top spot at home in 1956, and 4 years later is leapfrogged by the Soviet Union. Here again we see politics come into play as the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union begins leaking into sports. In 1964, a united German team containing athletes from both East and West Germany places fourth, while the US passes the Soviet Union for first and then pulls farther ahead in 1968, closely followed by Hungary. Then East Germany jumps into the lead in a 1972 Games that is absolutely dominated by the Eastern Bloc. The dominance continues in the next 2 Summer Games, with East Germany posting huge scores and Bulgaria jumping into the top 5. The US boycotts the 1980 Moscow Games in protest of Russia's invasion of Afghanistan, which from a modern perspective has some irony to it. 64 other nations also boycott to varying degrees as well. Then, 4 years later, the Soviet Union and 13 other Eastern Bloc nations retaliate by boycotting the 84 Los Angeles Games, prompting some huge shifts on the leaderboard, which now features the US, followed by Romania, Canada, West Germany, and New Zealand. The Eastern Bloc returns for another huge performance in 1988, led once again by East Germany and the Soviet Union, but it would be a last hurrah. The 1992 leaderboard reflects the major geopolitical shifts that occurred in the early 90s. A freshly reunified Germany grabs the top spot, followed by Cuba, Hungary, and the unified team, which contains most of the recently dissolved Soviet Union. In 96, Australia again reaches first, Cuba makes another top 5, and the modern version of Russia makes its first appearance. The Netherlands grab a top 5 spot in the 2000 Sydney Games, while Australia increases its lead at home, and continues to lead all the way through the 2008 Games. Here, Great Britain and Jamaica both make big leaps, and then Great Britain overtakes everyone at home in the 2012 London Games, and continues to lead in 2016, followed by the United States and New Zealand. And that, finally, brings us to today. When we throw in the GDP per capita element, we can see that way more poor nations do well in the summer games than in the winter. I'm guessing this is because snow and ice is hard to find in a lot of the world, and because summer events often require less gear. Finland again looks pretty good here, as well as Hungary. Romania emerges from the pack just slightly starting in the 50s, as does Cuba later on. Romania looks really good in 1984, and then much later, you can begin to see the emergence of Jamaica. That was a lot of information to sort through. But we still haven't answered the biggest question: which country is the greatest of all time? For the Winter Olympics, the answer is easy. It's Norway. You don't really even need my formula to figure that out. Austria and Germany round out the all-time Winter Olympics podium. For the Summer Olympics, it depends on how you count it. If you calculate a nation's average score based only on the Olympics in which it competed, then the answer is East Germany. If you want to count only the last 30 years or so, then the answer is Australia. Count only the last 10, and the answer is Great Britain. But if you calculate an average over all 31 Summer Olympic Games, then the best Summer Olympic nation is the United States, followed by Germany, and then Sweden. Combining the summer and winter results to calculate an overall best nation is tricky, and I basically ran out of both time and spreadsheet cells to do this thoroughly, but I think there could be two schools of thought here. Purely based on the math, Norway would be the best ever. They don't do very well at all in the Summer Games, but their performance in the Winter Games is so good it just overwhelms everything else. However, if you think that the best overall nation should be actually good at both the Summer and Winter Games, then I think you have to go with Germany, which is on the all-time medal stand in both the Summer and Winter Games. Giving the overall title to Germany means we have to allow Germany to count as a single nation despite its complex history over the past 125 years, but I think it's fair as long as you combine the scores from East and West Germany when they competed separately. To round out the all-time podium, I would add Sweden and Finland, two nations that also do very well in both the Summer and Winter Games. So, there you have it. Every Olympic Games is ranked by the impressiveness-o-meter. Let's see, how do we sum this up? I didn't think I was going to spend so much time in this video talking about history, World War I, Nazis, the Cold War, etc., but I probably should have known better. The Olympics is so intimately tied to money and history and world politics that you can't get away from these things even when you're just playing silly math games with medal results. I guess it's kind of sadly appropriate that this video is coming out during the Tokyo Summer Games, an Olympic Games that is taking place in the middle of a pandemic against the wishes of the vast majority of the host nation's citizens. I also think there's a point here that extends beyond the Olympics themselves. Olympic rankings don't have a huge impact on the world, at least I hope they don't. But there are a lot of ranking systems that do touch our lives every day. Student grades, college rankings, job application assessments. Heck, you probably only found this video because of some video ranking algorithm. These ranking systems all claim to be accurate and fair and helpful. Maybe they sometimes are, but each of them is just a single specific way of measuring value. And as we've seen, there's always more than one way to go about that. Thanks for watching, and make sure to come back in a few weeks when we'll slice and dice all the results from Tokyo.